So what we're going to share with you today is a significant portion of a research project that Firelight was commissioned to do by Wahkohtowin. And we did this project in the context of FSC certification, but as you will learn as Jess presents our results, is that FSC certification wasn't necessarily the full driving force of discussion, because what we were really interested is in understanding the context in which so many people are operating today, doing all kinds of landscape level planning, whether it's land use planning, traditional use studies. People are involved in environmental impact assessments. They're involved in negotiating, large and far-reaching benefit agreements. Communities have also been involved in planning for Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and really, and also too, of course, all the other things that we know and are more familiar with. People are still negotiating treaties. They're still in specific claims. So in all of that context, we wanted to carve out an opportunity to talk very specifically about a couple of important elements that we thought were very significant to communities when they consider working within a certification context. So there's this wonderful concept that was introduced at FSC Canada around 6 years ago, and it was introduced by the Aboriginal Chamber, and it was called the Indigenous cultural landscape. And this concept is an old concept, and it actually comes from anthropology, archaeology. There was a lot of work done centuries ago around artists and people who painted landscapes and why they painted and visualized things the way they did. That concept has been taken and moved into resource management through these programs and these projects that I just mentioned, traditional use studies and land use planning, to understand better human roles, responsibilities, and interactions with lands that are under stress from development. So I always want to pay tribute and say Chimwe Goetch to advisors from Pakanjikum First Nation who actually brought this concept to light and really put it in front of the Aboriginal Chamber of FSC Canada and said, we really think that this idea of an Indigenous cultural landscape has something to offer FSC, has something to offer the world in general. So this project is the start of that. And with, next slide, please. And Jess is going to go over the short agenda, and then I'll jump back in with tying in a little bit of what Elena's wonderful presentation introduced us to with the actual project.
Thanks, Pamela. Yeah, so as we introduced the concept of Indigenous cultural landscapes, and that short video had introduced the concept of FSC certification, today's webinar has a specific approach to sharing with you the goals of this project, which is really a case study that we have conducted as a pilot with Mystic Management. And so we're going to situate that case study in a specific context of FSC certification, a forest management context. Pamela will also introduce that through a few slides just to situate ourselves in the context. And then I will share the research approach that we took as a research team, employing culturally appropriate methodologies. Then we will get deeper into the case study, which we conducted, and the themes and results, basically our findings from this case study with Mystic Management. We're going to talk about those findings in the context of values, respect and relationships, and temporal aspects of time, the past, present, and the future. And then we'll get into a bit of a discussion about those Indigenous cultural landscapes, the findings, and specifically in the Forest Stewardship Council certification context, the FSC context. So just next slide, I will introduce very briefly the project goals, and then we'll hand it back over to Pamela. Our project intention was first to develop some learning resources. This is part of it. Sharing with you all in this room in this way is part of developing those learning resources that will remain available on WDGP's website as tools that Indigenous peoples, communities, those working in forestry can use to self-identify cultural landscapes. And some of those tools are available through our research and the end goals of our work, which are to produce a toolkit that includes interview guides. The process that we use to conduct this case study will be available. And then we also wanted to assess the opportunities within the FSC standard to incorporate Indigenous cultural landscapes. And the ways that we did that were to conduct this case study and to share with you the format of the case study that we've conducted with Mystic Management Limited. So just over to you, Pamela, next to speak specifically about the context here. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Next slide, Erin. So what I'm going to do is just introduce in a very abstract way one of the reasons why local communities, First Nations organizations may get involved with certification, but FSC certification specifically. So there's three kind of contexts that we're looking at. We're looking at the forest management context, what's going on around you and on your territory. We're going to just abstractly talk about the legal and constitutional frameworks, and also the conservation work that's going on. And right now, after the federal budget, there's a lot of discussion about what that might look like into the future. So this slide here is just highlighting the fact that forestry in particular happens at a local, has impacts on local people. It is conducted by companies that may be locally situated, they may be international, they may be regionally situated, it depends on where you are. And in Canada in particular, we all know that how forestry happens is governed by a provincial context. So that's important. So again, our case study is very specific to one region, it's Saskatchewan, and it's Mystic. And I apologize, I have my dog in the background who's very upset. Next slide. So we all know to a lesser extent, unless you're on federal lands, that the federal government does have a role to play in setting out how forestry is conducted, how conservation strategies are developed. And one of the important roles that certification has is attempting to connect federal roles and federal suggestions through, and also to the federal government is the body that basically engages Canada as a whole in international conventions. So we have the Convention on Biological Diversity as an example. We have UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So it's the federal body that connects our local communities with these international instruments. Next slide. And the international arena, while it's far away and it seems further away depending on where you are in the country, it does have an influence on how we work in Canada, particularly in forestry. For those of you who are in the business at the moment, you know that the price of lumber, it can go up and down, and it has an incredible influence on how industry is performing and activities that are happening on your land. So again, that's the global context of the forest sector. Next slide. So what we understand is that the FSC certification and the 10 principles that Elena introduced is one way of connecting your experience on the ground locally with these international contexts. Next slide. And this happens through the criteria that Elena mentioned, the indicators that are mentioned. We can't, the requirements of the FSC certification require you to, the old saying, think locally, think globally, act locally, FSC certification supports that. And the same thing is true for legal and constitutional foundations. At the local level, we have in FSC certification, people that are affected by certification are known as affected rights holders, as a way of really emphasizing within the system that, and acknowledging that people are directly affected by how forestry happens. Again, we have the legal requirements of the province and the federal government and the international laws and standards. Next slide. This FSC certification connects just as the same way it does with forest management. Next slide. Now, conservation strategies, there are a number of principles within FSC that have a significant focus on conservation as a way to mitigate impacts. So conservation strategies and concepts that are introduced into the system are really important to understand in the same way. So those of you at the community level, you may have been a part of doing voluntary set-asides. You may have voluntary put moratoriums on harvesting of local resources for many different reasons. And those are if you want to label it, that's a conservation strategy. At a community level, it might be protocol, that this is just what you do, this is the right thing to do. And of course, again, like in all the other examples I've given, you work up the provincial, you have parks and protected areas, national protected areas, and you have the Convention on Biological Diversity at the international level, which directly and indirectly affects how we experience forest management and how we experience conservation strategies locally. And again, the 10 principles, the criteria, and the 220 indicators associated with those principles and criteria connect all of these processes together. So I just wanted to finish off this section. So that was a bit of an abstract presentation, but really what we wanted to do is focus on FSC exists. It's a system. It's an important system that took many years to develop, but this particular project is really focusing on some learning resources, because ultimately what is really important is that certification is the responsibility of the certificate holder. The big word that Elena introduced at the top of her slide was the organization. That is the forest company that is seeking to be FSC certified or seeking to maintain their certificate. Their responsibility is to be in compliance with the standard. So that sits in their court. But communities have an important role to play should they want to. And that's what the purpose of this particular presentation is to help in just one small, important but small aspect of FSC certification, introduce where and how communities might be involved in engaging in FSC certification. And over to you, Jess.
Thanks very much. All right, so this slide here, and we can pause here for a moment, Erin, thanks, Pamela, is that we are sharing the approach that we took in this first pilot case study. And this is one of the tools that will become part of the toolkit of learning resources. We recognize there are many ways to approach this kind of work and research. The many ways to approach the where and how Indigenous communities may self-identify their cultural landscapes. So our intention here is to share so that other people can, and the intention is to take up this work and improve upon it in the future, that it really becomes a kit of multiple different ways of viewing where and how Indigenous cultural landscapes are on the landscape across Turtle Island. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Erin. We took an approach at Firelight, and the work that we do here is sensitive to cultural protocols, and we have our own internal policies around culturally appropriate methodologies. And culturally appropriate is also a term used within the FSC context. It has its own meaning. The work that we have conducted, we began with an open line of inquiry, where we structured interviews to be one-on-one or small focus groups, whatever interviewees were comfortable with, that supported open conversations about those activities and the places and the meaning of those relationships, the connection back to the land was. We started by sharing a description of Indigenous cultural landscapes as a way to support the analysis, but not to drive the interview. This wasn't a survey, this wasn't a yes or no kind of response, do you agree, not agree? It was really a semi-structured process that began with being first open-minded to understand what those answers we were going to receive would be. So in mentioning that we shared a single description of Indigenous cultural landscapes, this informed how we structured the interview questions. For those of you who are doing interviews or developing surveys, you understand the meaning of leading questions, and that was something that we really sought to avoid. So we were not leading people down a specific road of this must be a description of Indigenous cultural landscapes, but rather an open mind and curiosity. Where we trusted the people that we were interviewing and having those conversations with to share their experiences, and accepting that we may end up in unexpected places. So as Pamela has mentioned, we started this work at a time where we were unable to meet with people in person, and we conducted those conversations virtually through this kind of method, through Zoom. And so those were also some of the unexpected beginnings of this journey, and we had findings that were a result of those kinds of conversations. So we'll get a bit deeper into that. Next slide, Erin. Just to highlight in this slide where and how many people we spoke with as part of this case study research. Now, participants were identified as being community members who had experience in relationships to the land or the forest, and those relationships existed for work, through work with the forest company, and also for personal reasons. So the participant recruitment was possible because of the forest management company and its relationships with community members. Mystic, as the forest company, greatly assisted with identification of case study participants, and this was largely based on their existing relationships. So community participants included those who were participating from co-management boards, so existing relationships on the co-management board, but also included 2 mayors of the hamlets, as well as forest workers, elders, and active land users. Those who were really active on the land, both for work and personal, as I mentioned. And many of the interviews were individual, but there was also a couple of group interviews with several community members coming together. 12 participants in total with really diverse forest management responsibilities, including 5 current or former employees of the company, Mystic Management, and 7 members of the communities. These communities are Canoe Lake First Nation, and Johns Bay and Coal Bay. And it's important to note that the communities of Johns Bay and Coal Bay are also Métis communities, and Canoe Lake is a First Nation community as well. So we'll just go to the next slide, Erin, where we'll introduce as well the work that participants had conducted. And the case study was really about the forest management company. The 3 communities that were identified that we worked with, where participants were living, are the communities that Mystic works with closely on co-management boards. And the company, the forest management company, has been exemplified in past case studies. Since 1989, this company has been FSC certified, and since 1989, the forest company has been in operation and FSC certified since 2007. The forest management company holds forest management planning responsibility, and through certification through FSC, it is a supplier to the Meadow Lake Mechanical Pulp and North Sask Forest Products Limited. The ownership structure is quite interesting, and we share that structure here on this slide. Just to note that the responsibility that Mystic holds is a large responsibility for both forest management planning, and it's a long-term player in the area of FSC certification for those two subsidiary companies. Its ownership structure means that the interest and the role of Indigenous members is quite significant, with the Meadow Lake Tribal Council having a vested interest and commitment to what happens on the landscape. Now, this is also what we had heard through our documentation and through previous case studies as well, and through conversations in our interviews, was that there were significant challenges to Mystic's operations in the early days. In 1992, a significant blockade to Mystic's operations, and several of the community members were front and center in those blockades. And so several decades later, 30 years later, it's been a long journey. And we just want to recognize that that journey is part of what we have been learning about through this case study documentation, is arriving at this place now because of those actions in the early days throughout and leading up to co-management and the other findings of our case study. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Erin. And we'll just introduce here the case study question. So our question in going into this research was really, as Pamela alluded to, the where and the how. How do communities who are participating in FSC certification describe or delineate their cultural landscape? And this question came about through many years of dialogue and exploration. Pamela herself has been having exploration with Wahkohtowin Development Group and FSC Canada. And this emerging research question became one that we decided to tackle through case study as a research methodology. And we were able to ask these questions because Mystic is FSC certified, and it already has had to address these kinds of questions on the landscape level. It uses landscape level planning to recognize and protect Indigenous rights while it is conducting its forest management activities. So we'll just go to the next slide, Erin. And how we conducted this research, I mentioned case study as a research methodology. We introduced the research topic and that question on the last slide to the prospective participants in a way that gave them time for reflection, and often those kitchen table discussions that happen around the kitchen table with family and friends before participants would agree to an interview. So we provided the questions in advance, and we provided a 2-page document that outlined what we were asking, why we were asking, and seeking consent and permission. And that was shared through email, but I had mentioned that this kind of research has been operating under this environment for some time, and email was not always as well received as a hard copy piece of paper. So we were very fortunate that Mystic was already conducting its co-management board meetings and was able to share this in a 2-page introduction to the project as well. And we were able to schedule those interviews in focus groups and conduct them by Zoom. With permission. Each interview was audio recorded, and the research team, we performed at least one round of listening to each of those interviews in order to record the findings in a short summary of key points. And part of permission was also to share back in a verification step. So everyone who participated in an interview was invited to reflect on what was said and to suggest changes and corrections to their information. So after that was conducted, a summary, partial targeted transcription was conducted for each interview. And given the time constraints, we shared that round and then started to perform our analysis. And we would suggest considering in future a full transcription of each interview, that future case studies might benefit from more fully utilizing some standard techniques, such as in traditional use studies and different in-depth types of research. Just go to the next slide, Erin. And And to just say that this case study now takes a closer look at the relationships between those cultural landscapes and these three communities in northern Saskatchewan. So this is a specific local context, a specific regional and provincial context. And future case studies would also benefit from looking at a diversity of forest management practices, governance arrangements, and different jurisdictions as well. Next slide, please, Erin. So this is where the communities are located within Mystic's forest management area, which is shown just in the small inset. Mystic Management is responsible for a forest management area of close to nearly 2 million hectares of boreal forest in northwestern Saskatchewan. And this area is covered by Treaty 6 and under the current legal framework and operations and tenure from the provincial government. The FMA is located next to the Caribou Flats Ecological Reserve, as well as the three communities mentioned here, adjacent to Canoe Lake First Nation and Johns Bay and Cole Bay. Next slide, please, Erin. All right, so this slide also acknowledges the process and the steps that were taken to acknowledge respect and reciprocity, to thank and honor the time of people who had given their knowledge and their expertise. Now, the company wanted to make time as well for those reciprocal relationships through this project, but has been doing that on an ongoing basis. And so this image in the center of the boots on the ground was really to exemplify that Mystic has its boots on the ground and was really in tune with what might make sense as reciprocity. So everyone that we spoke to who participated as a community member in our interviews was gifted with a bundle of wood that came from the forest sawmill operations. And this also was to thank folks for their time, but also an acknowledgement of that relationship, that ongoing relationship with the forest. And that doesn't just happen through this research, but it stems from an ongoing learnings that Mystic has done, and it has developed a policy with respect to its relations with Indigenous peoples. And this policy came up over and over again in our conversations with Mystic staff and board members. In addition to this policy, Mystic has an agreement to pay the land through co-management fees. So it's really through those boots on the ground that we were able to learn about Mystic's ongoing operations with respect and reciprocity to the land and as well to those who participate in this case study. So the entire project here is about investigating cultural landscapes and what they potentially mean in the context of forest certification. So we share here the description that FSC Canada and at the international generic indicators level, FSC International had developed in 2018. And thank you, David, for also sharing just a few notes as well. We would post those throughout the chat and in our Q&A follow-up as well for some links to access this information for yourselves. There started with the FSC International, a proposed description of Indigenous cultural landscapes. And we're trying to make this, this really relevant, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes people and minds and hearts coming together to have come to this point in 2018. And it is, as we had referred to in our work, a descriptive definition. So the components within this definition are really what make up a cultural landscape or an Indigenous cultural landscape within the context of FSC. On the next slide, Erin, we have highlighted here 4 major elements comprising Indigenous cultural landscapes. Thanks, Erin. What we're looking here in the first line are the values, and those 4 values: environmental, social, cultural, and economic. Those values are really because that's what came through in that descriptive definition, but that's also what came through in our conversations. And we started to hear about those overlapping values where somebody would go out on the landscape, you know, for example, to harvest from the forest for economic value, but also be reconnecting socially, culturally with the landscape as well. And it's about those reconnections, it's about those relationships that endure over time. And that temporal aspect really came through in the present and the future. As well, we heard a lot about the land care knowledge and adaptive livelihood practices. So this idea of livelihoods adapting over time became really important, and you can see here that many of these aspects that are highlighted are all interconnected and interrelated. And ultimately, livelihood is very important for continuing responsibility over stewardship on the landscape. Thanks, Erin. So how did we really get to some of the answers that we're going to share with you on the next slide? So we won't go through all of the case study questions in depth. These are the questions that we started with. As mentioned, it was an interview guide that was open-ended. So while these questions were shared with participants in advance, we didn't necessarily spend equal time on all of them. Some interviews we were able to spend a lot more time on the advice. For example, if somebody had gone through co-management experiences, they may be able to give really, really pertinent advice that comes through in the case study. And some we spent a lot more time on the important activities that were connecting people back to the relationship with the land. Yeah, and before I just hand it over to Pamela, I will say that those 4 questions were really informing how we came up with our themes and ultimately how we came up with the results that we're sharing with you in this case study. So if we're ready, we'll just go to the next slide of themes, and I'll pass it back over to Pamela.
Great, thank you, Jess. So I'm hoping that what you're able to see is that while the cultural landscape definition wasn't the driving force of conversation, we didn't want even just the terminology, a cultural landscape, to really trip people up in how they described their relationships, the values, and really what was important to them. So, but we did present the definition in effort to be transparent, that in fact the entire project and where we were coming from is driven by this desire to investigate the appropriateness of the concept and whether or not it's a good thing to do and a good way to go forward to bring it into the FSC certification. So it's important that Jess just mentioned in terms, you'll notice the definition, it had a reference to an international document. So in the Canadian context right now, the way the FSC standard is written, it does not mention cultural landscapes. So what had happened is the Canada was instrumental in helping to design the concept, to really put some initial thoughts around the definition and to explore. But we also were quite far along as an FSC organization to develop the standard. So the concept was there, the standard was being developed at the same time. What happened was FSC International, through a series of meetings and workshops, recognized that there likely was some value, and it was likely going to support the implementation of UNDRIP and the implementation of free, prior, and informed consent. But again, they didn't know how it was going to do that. So in the international documentation that guides all national offices across the world, you will find that definition is in the rule book, if you want to say. The definition is there. And also Indigenous cultural landscapes are, the concept is sprinkled through a couple of different principles at the international level, but there are no indicators developed yet. So that's really important in terms of where we're at. That's why it was important to come at this from a research perspective, because we don't know exactly how it's going to work. But it was, you know, a lot of support for FSC for throwing open the doors and the opportunity to do the analysis. And in effect, essentially critique the standard that they just recently developed. So after doing these 12 interviews and going through your research process of coding and putting themes together, this is what we found. Next slide. So in one instance, again, it's important, it's one part of the country with one company. We found that people were most interested in talking about values associated with food and economic opportunity, and we can share some of those examples. Respect and relationships was important in terms of association with the forest company, or what in FSC would be called the organization. So the relationship and the respect needed to be there with the communities, and just mentioned it wasn't always there in this particular case, and there was a lot of hard work that had to happen working through some of the issues, and issues still exist today, but every day, because of the relationship, they have a venue to work through any issues that arise. And then time. People in the interviews spoke a lot of past experiences. People may have reflected on experiences that they had with their parents and their grandparents on the land. And it was a privilege to hear people provide those reflections and teachings that were important to them. But they also spent a lot of time talking about the present concerns, present opportunities, and really people were interested in looking forward, taking on that responsibility of bringing the land back and re-engaging with the land in a way where they were truly engaging and truly practicing not just their right, their Indigenous right, but their responsibility to that land. So a lot of references were made to education opportunities, to maintaining cabins and trap lines and family gathering opportunities. So there was a lot of emphasis. People wanted to look forward. And the key term that people were using in that case was restoration. Not just restoration of the land, really important, but really restoration of that relationship. A lot of communities, and some of you are maybe experiencing this right now, development has, in many cases, recently in particular, alienated people from different parts of their landscape. We don't need to imagine, it doesn't take a lot of energy to understand some of the tremendous negative impacts that development has had on alienating people from land. They're not able to access parts of their territory, whether through restrictions or linear development or whatever it might be. But really, a lot of the reference to restoration was around restoring that relation, restoring that understanding, and bringing people and the land back into the family fold. So I think that that's a really important concept that evolves out of our conversations. Next slide. So this is, we didn't ask specifically to have people share their favorite animals and their favorite species at risk or things like that. But one of, as you know, when you talk to people and you get people sharing reflections and talking about their most favorite activities and relationships to have on the land, the little creatures often come forward. And those of us who often are working in this area of development or trying to understand these particular concepts like species at risk and the charismatic species, we're all familiar with caribou, we're familiar with the bigger exciting animals that cover large landscapes, grizzly bears and wolves. That's such centered in sort of the conservation world. And what I loved personally about looking at the outcomes of this is the the small ones, the ones with the small but keen eyes. And I've got a picture of a pine marten there because as an example of my own experience interviewing elders who were trappers in British Columbia who were being severely infected by the mountain pine beetle outbreak, and also forestry's proposed and continued management practices on that. And no matter what question I asked, people only wanted to talk to me about pine marten. And all of my photos are about pine marten and about traps. And I think it was an important lesson learned that while internationally and federally there are some important species, and for many different reasons we can agree or disagree with it, that hold the limelight, locally it's incredibly important to acknowledge the species that help people maintain the relationship to their land. So I think that came out loud and clear as well in our interviews. Next slide. So the other thing that we talked about is, and it's a really important part of the cultural landscape concept, when different people were contributing to drafting that descriptive definition, one of the themes that came out of those conversations was really focusing on what, as Indigenous people, what role do we have in kind of pulling back the world from the path that it's on. And we had elders, knowledge holders, we had people who worked in constitutional law from many different backgrounds. And they always talked about the ability of our knowledge holders, the ability of our activities on the land to make obvious interdependencies between people, but dependencies that people have on the landscape that often go unnoticed. So for those of you who've had to go through traditional use studies, for example, or you've had to go through an archaeological impact assessment, there's all of these processes in place where you have to prove as an Indigenous person a connection to the land, and there's these features that you get to identify, and beautiful maps get created. But really, what I was told by people that I discussed this concept with all over the world was those individual features are important, but the sum of the parts is what is really the essence of the cultural landscape. It's how all those parts connect with one another. And I think one of the things that comes out in the discussion about restoration and relationship building, and where the cultural landscape idea and concept seems to fit in, is bringing forward those interdependencies. And if you can imagine a map, how do the different parts of the landscape get connected? Why is one part of the territory heavily used versus other parts of the territory more sparsely used? And what's the connection between those? And I think there are exercises and tools that communities are engaging in right now, and I've mentioned a lot of them, that really support that investigation. And the cultural landscape term is really just a terminology to capture a lot of that landscape level work. So we might call it a cultural landscape or an Indigenous cultural landscape planning process, for example, and somebody else might call it an area of special interest, or might call it a territorial plan. So it's really, we're inundated with labeling things when you use the English language, and particularly when you work in certification and in law, just like in law, you're forced to put a label on something. And it's not until you label it and name it that somebody can actually do something with it. One of the things that we emphasized in the project is we don't need to use the term cultural landscape, that the term can be whatever the local community chooses it to be. It could be the name of their land. It could be a relationship to the name of the relationship that they wish to highlight, and whatever that is. But I think the respect aspect for that naming process, the respect for highlighting the interdependencies was a very significant outcome as well from the case studies. Next slide. And this is just reflected. And Erin, if you hit it a couple of more times, the rest of it pops up there. Thank you. So we know the past, present, and the future. So there are these dominant conservation concepts. We've used the words already: parks, protected areas, species at risk. There's protected area networks. There's also a concept around the world, intact forest landscape. So these are, concepts and management strategies and practices that First Nations, Indigenous people have engaged with for a very long time and have had positive and not so positive experiences. But what is emerging are these Indigenous-led concepts and the Indigenous-led processes, I think, that are bringing to the forefront protocols and knowledge that has been lacking for many years. So I've talked about Indigenous protected areas, IPCAs, cultural landscapes, what we're talking about today. There's also cultural keystone species and biocultural indicators. So I think Indigenous peoples are really stepping out in front and really taking on the leadership role. And for perhaps the first time, others seem to be watching and really encouraging this leadership. So I think it's an important note to hold on to when we consider where this work could go in the future. Next slide. And I think we've got only a couple more slides left. So one of the things that in terms of putting our project together and setting and managing expectations for a project, as you could imagine, people from different audiences wanted to see different things. So a forest manager would likely want to see a map. FSC wanted to see some indicators, and others wanted to see more text descriptions and storylines of how they could better communicate the importance of recognizing a cultural landscape. So when the question we've gotten a lot is, what is an ICL going to look like? And our answer is how that cultural landscape will be depicted and shared will depend on the community, but it's clear two things: the relationship with the certificate holder and the future aspirations of the community are going to be significant driving factors. So these are some examples on this slide to just show how a cultural landscape may be depicted. Some may decide to go, and they may be in a position to map their landscape with great detail based on their own protocols and their own research and definitions. Some may be at the stage of being able to put buffers around areas of importance because they haven't gotten to the place where they can adequately address all the important places. So maybe they can take parts of the landscape at a time. Some are still going to be solely dependent on conversations. It's going to be a place by place, an activity by activity discussion, and people are going to have to come together and talk about it. And then there's still others that are going to present their values, present their relationships and understandings of their roles and responsibilities and stewardships in a visual way that's more in an I guess you could call it abstract, but the concentric circles, the dream catcher is a great example of that. I remember seeing, for example, a couple of early iterations of a First Nations land use plan, and it was a series of concentric circles that was divided up into seasons. And that one visual poster communicated to me in a very quick order the relationships that were of importance to the community. And it's the job of the forest company in that particular example to figure out how to protect and to enhance those relationships. So we don't know what a cultural landscape is going to look like, but there are many options in front of us and a lot of good work that people are doing. Next slide. And again, there's another. So one of the things that we just wanted to say, and really a driving force of the project, is the square peg round hole. On the left-hand side, the assumption, because we're FSC certification and certification in general in the forest management context, makes some really important assumptions that not everybody agrees with. So the round in the center, the forest management unit, is it's a tenure that has been permitted by government. Likely that permit was given without consent, and people dispute the boundaries of those permits. But regardless, the permit exists. How forest management is done and how certification is done at the moment is everything, and I've just given examples, from forest strategies to legal understanding, and in this context, cultural landscapes, they're viewed as constraints on that. So we have to, it's the responsibility, for example, of the community to identify values so that at some point and somehow they will become constraints on how the land is managed by the forest company. That's the dominant model. That's the status quo, what's going on. On the right-hand side, and people have talked about this for many years, this isn't new. What if we decided to approach forest management with the complete understanding and acceptance that this practice, forestry, is taking place on Indigenous territories, on Indigenous lands, and that inside of those territories and the people that are associated there, they have values, there's a governance system in place, and there's a desire to continue those relationships. What if that was an accepted principle and forest management and Western legal consideration and Western conservation strategies were considered constraints? What would the world look like then? So I think the cultural landscape is pushing will push forest managers, will push forest companies to really move from the left to the right. And I think principles within FSC, such as Principle 3 on recognizing and upholding Indigenous rights, recognizing and upholding the right to free, prior, and informed consent, and also the requirement to uphold the articles of UNDRIP that are directly affected by forest management. Those three things alone are going to force forest companies and managers to think of a different way of just visualizing and conceptualizing their starting point for forestry. So that's the end of my presentation. But one of the happy coincidences that with Wahkohtowin being the sponsor of this project and commissioning this work is the moment the engagement started with interviews, it was the term Wahkohtowin opened up conversation. And Jess, I don't know if you would like to kind of share your experiences with this, because it speaks a lot, I think, to methodology, and it speaks a lot to how you approach people, and how we were lucky enough to be grounded in this really important word.
It certainly was a happy coincidence. It didn't flavor the the conversation, but because we were working in the context of Canoe Lake Cree First Nation, there were many Cree language speakers, and even those who were not fluent in Cree language had many of them had heard about the concept of Wahkohtowin, and we got a little bit of a language lesson and pronunciation lesson, and we also went and did our own homework as researchers and looking up what some of the other meanings that people who are familiar with this word had attributed to it. And so it was very fitting as we were talking about relationships and asking people to describe their relationships with the land that Wahkohtowin came up. And so we offered offer here one of the definitions that we have read about, but also through the case study, people were able to describe to us what their relationship was, that it was like family. The relationship between people and life in the forest was really emphasized as ultimately important. There are just 2 more slides here, which we may just breeze through and show you. Miigwech, thank you so much for your time and energy to listen to this. Thank you for your questions that you've been posing in the chat box. You can also continue to pose those. We're going to summarize the questions right now in the last few minutes. But also, the very last slide we have here is another reflective question for you, which is if you would like to see more of these webinars, they will be posted on Wahkohtowin Development Group's website. And we offer that here as a way for you to continue to connect with this subject, this important work. And we will continue to be available to answer questions through the rest of the time we have together. So thanks very much. And thank you so much, Pamela, to David, to all our co-presenters for a great presentation. Thanks. Okay, so we'll end the screen share, and I'll just summarize a couple of questions here and then do a bit of traffic moderation. If we have questions that come up on the chat, we will try to address those. We want to recognize it is now top of the hour, and we've asked everyone for their time for 90 minutes, so thank you. Thank you so much for the thanks that is coming up on the chat. I'm going to summarize the first question here, which is how common is FSC certification? And I know that we had been, we might be able to respond to that. How common is FSC certification? Maybe a great question for David.
Yeah, thank you. So I wear many hats, and it just so happens that I am the chair of FSC Canada. Currently, I've been on the board for 4 years. This will be my last year in, it ends in November, my term. But just broadly speaking, FSC is in over 80 countries around the world. There's over 225 million hectares certified, and Canada is one of the world leaders with just about 50 million hectares. Since the rollout of the new national standard, we anticipate seeing another 10 million hectares in Canada certified to the new national forest standard. A lot of companies were waiting to make sure they were going to get certified using the new national forest standard. So it's present in just about every province, with the exception of Manitoba, I believe, and their territories and farther north. It's more in the commercial forestry belt in the boreal and in our coastal forests. And looks like Aaron's chimed in with a comment as well.
Yeah, I was just saying that looking it up online, there's currently 56 forest management certifications throughout Canada across all the provinces.
There's a nuance to forest certification, and it's called controlled wood and chain of custody. It's a way for the system to blend wood coming from sources that are from 5 categories. That's a whole nother webinar. So I look forward to presenting that kind of a webinar. But if you add up also the chain of custodies that occur in Canada in provinces where there's not as many certificates, pretty much every company is involved in FSC one way or the other. Whether they're a certificate holder on a designated forest management land base, or they're producing fiber into the FSC system.
Great, we're getting several questions coming up on the Q&A. We had one earlier just asking about is clear cutting and the use of herbicide okay under FSC certification? I think those are 2 parts of a question. They may deserve 2 different responses there. And
my experience. Would you like me to go?
Yes, please, David. We're just seeing a few questions about clear cutting as well, so that's a big topic.
Okay. Yeah, it certainly is. The there is no outright obligation that FSC is anti-clear cutting as a certification body. Most companies now, well, any certified company needs to use harvesting and silviculture systems that are ecosystem driven. So there may be some forest types that, for example, pine forests, where it's not meant to be multi-succession that's not the type of ecosystem driver. So there would be some level of patch cutting, but there is a growing knowledge and awareness to be ecosystem relevant. That if they were to mimic fire, fire doesn't burn all of the material and coarse woody debris. There's still remnant insular and peninsular standing timber, and so clear cut in the sense of clear it, make it look like a turned over farmland. No, it does not promote conversion and plantations as a certification system. And as for herbicides, there is the requirement for the organization and the certificate holder to show a continuous reduction in the use of pesticides over time, and that's audited and reported on annually. So we have some direct experience. For example, that's where that herbicide alternatives program is something to watch on our website about how a company has been working on different ways and approaches and collaborating with communities on reducing herbicide use. So the commitment is to reduce the use of herbicide and pesticide.
Thanks very much for that thorough answer on both parts of those questions about clear cuts and herbicides. Okay, and I'm going to try to see about summarizing some of these questions that are coming up in the chat as well. Of course, there's another question about seeing, okay, so we've answered a question about clear cut, and who can initiate the process to obtain certification? That's another great question.
Pam, do you want to take a stab at that one? Just with some of your experience in other provinces as well?
Yeah, sure. So I just typed out quickly a response to that one, but so again, certification is usually sought out by a forest company because they are looking to gain access to a market that demands FSC certified wood. So if you are a producer of solid wood products, you may be supplying to a market where FSC certification is seen as a prime material. So you would look for FSC certification. And like David introduced, if you are a pulp paper contributor and you have an agreement with a company that wants to produce FSC certified paper or toilet paper, then that company would be interested in seeking FSC certification. But what we also say, and why the Aboriginal Chamber exists in many ways, and why anybody kind of from an Indigenous rights perspective, why they have engaged in this process, any community can also investigate and ask questions about certification. So feel free to connect with FSC. I know that if there isn't webinar material yet, Wahkohtowin may be producing some materials in the near future around different parts of the system. So certification bodies, for example. Rainforest Alliance was a very well-known group of people. They have the frog. If you've got your toilet paper nearby and if there's a little frog on the back, it'll say Rainforest Alliance. They're an example of a certification body. They're auditors. So they go in and they check to make sure that the forest company is meeting the standards of that certification. So they are often the ones with a lot of information as well. So you can seek out certification bodies, but ultimately FSC has an amazing website. It's a little tricky to get around. And I think that this is what Wahkohtowin is working on, is simplifying the pathway to get information to communities. So there is a part of the website, I can't remember the exact name right now, but you can pick up any paper product that has an FSC logo on it. And there's really small letters below the logo, which is the license number. And you can go onto the FSC website and put in that license number, and information will come up. So this is part of what David was referring to as the chain of custody. So you can figure out where your products have come to. They'll tie you back to a particular region at a particular company, but you can also go the other way. You can search on FSC website for companies that are perhaps operating in your area that may hold a certificate. And again, a really important thing to remember is certification happens at the land level. So you could have a company that might have one forest management unit FSC certified, and the management unit that's next to you where you are might not be FSC certified. So the certificate is attached to the land because that's where the behavior can be audited. So some communities, what they have done is they've approached companies and said, you're FSC certified over here. I'd like for you to think about being FSC certified next to us as well. So any person can connect and request and have more discussions about FSC certification.
I'll just put a quick supplement in, Pam. FSC Canada has an East and West coordinator at the staffing level. They can be contacted as well for direct information, and they can actually be contacted to assist First Nations in hosting those introductory meetings with companies to say, why not? What's this all about? How do we make this work? Are we interested? Is there and again, remember, this is a market-driven certification scheme, and that the market demands it. And what we're actually seeing is the market is now turning around, and actually the market being consumers, builders, buyers of products, the major production people are Procter and Gamble, 3M around the world. They're committing to utilize FSC certified products, and that's actually driving more companies to get FSC certified. So are you feeling the advocacy here?
Thanks for those answers, Pam and David. I had one question come in on the chat that was a comment and a question stating that different First Nations all across Turtle Island have varying relationships with the forestry companies that conduct work in their own territories. And the question was, how representative is our case study compared to other groups across Turtle Island?
I'll take a first stab at that one, and that is an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. In the very long, I think it's a 65-page report, Jess, that we have written that goes along with this webinar, is one of the things that we do emphasize, that it is a snapshot in time. It's one company and 3 communities. And you're absolutely right. There is the relationship, even within the FSC world, is quite variable. So one of our roles, and I think, Jess, you did mention it at the beginning, is to talk about, we're putting this work out as the first of what we hope to be many case studies or many projects similar to this that could help improve the implementation or the operationalization of a cultural landscape within certification. Because what we absolutely recognize is that 30-year relationship between Mystic and the communities is very potentially unique. There's probably a few others that we can all think of at the top of our head. But the other really interesting part, again, we didn't mention it here because Mystic isn't sitting here to talk about their own experience. they've had the same certificate coordinator, the manager who's responsible for keeping all the parts moving and people engaged and informed. He's been the certificate manager for 27 years. So, well, forester, and then managing the certificate from the beginning. So we all know that there's these great examples of good business practice and best business practices. UNDRIP, actually, there's a number of working groups that work on UNDRIP that have put out great papers on how third parties or businesses could work towards implementing UNDRIP. And one of their prime recommendations is to be consistent in who is engaging with the community. Pick the right person and be consistent. Don't adopt this turnover, because relationship, they recognize that relationship is so important. So there's that spectrum is very long of the relationships in terms of representation of our case study. We made, our pendulum is probably over here. If you had your gold, silver, bronze standard, it's probably over in the gold area. But again, they still have issues. But there are going to be companies particularly who are just starting out and to look at the potential for FSC, who've only ever followed provincial regulations when it came to consultation. That, you know, that's, you can imagine what that scenario will be like. It'll be difficult. The requirements are going to be foreign. The company may not actually be set up to actually address some of those requirements, but that's why FSC actually does and offers, and auditing bodies offer pre-assessment processes so that people can test out where their gaps are. So those, you know, that'll be at this end of the spectrum. But it's a really good question, a good point, and something that we do emphasize in all of our reporting.
Okay, there's a few questions on the Q&A still that we're going to try to resolve or just group very briefly. I had a quick answer on one of these questions about plants or seed harvesting or the preservation of traditional medicinal plants. And that question did come up, actually that answer came up in our case study. We didn't specifically ask about traditional or medicinal plants, but we heard about those. And it was intriguing to talk about species of special interest rather than just species at risk, which is defined by the COSAWIC, and the federal government has its own listing process. The species that were of special interest to the Indigenous cultural landscapes were not just limited to those large or small species at risk, but they also included plants and medicines. Rat root was one of them that was named, for example, and even raven. And areas of buffer are important to keep. That buffer depends on what that species needs to survive and be preserved. So the idea of buffers is very common in forestry concepts, but it is enacted by Mystic in its approach to special places, where it defines what is a buffer based on what is that animal or plant, through conversations with community members about where they have seen that species of special interest, where that observation has taken place, and how large of a buffer is needed around perhaps a raven's nest, perhaps around rat root, or any of those special and traditional plants. So that's one answer that I have. I'm seeing a lot of other questions up on the chat, and maybe we'll just try to cap it at what we are having right now. Yeah, okay. So I think that we've talked a little bit about the herbicides, and we've talked about the clear cuts, and that was a great answer from Pamela just now on our most recent question. So are there any thoughts on First Nations deeming their forest a living being with legal status in the Indigenous cultural landscapes? And the example that has been given is like the Maori with a living place, establishing personhood to a river in New Zealand. I believe it was a river and a mountain. The question that's coming up is about the river. So that's a great question. Did you want to tackle that, Pamela? I like to see if you'd like to put you on the spot, but as someone familiar with.
I would love to, but I see David unmuted himself first. So.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, you saw that, eh, Pam? Anyway, I just, again, I would encourage everybody to get to learn the standard a little bit better and the principles. And I would point to Principle 9 in high conservation value forests, and Principle 6. 6 and 9 are really interesting because they interplay with each other. One is about maintaining and understanding the gap analysis for ecosystem integrity across that unit, that forest area. And in combination with that, which also speaks about living, right? Living as a living entity, the ecosystems, but also high conservation value forests are an opportunity for Indigenous communities explicitly to talk about. And I would argue that, yes, this is part of what this research is about, is does that afford the opportunity for communities to identify a place, a polygon, a space of this kind of magnitude and significance, and then have prescriptions around it. I'm not here to tell you that you can protect 90% of that forest area under a high conservation value forest. What I can say is the principles allow you to enter that relationship with the company to understand and identify and set aside those priority areas of significance to your community. This is a little bit of new ground, but I would point to Principle 9 and encourage you to go and have a look at the webinar and see what kind of a fit it is to the response to that question. The short answer is yes. Pam?
My short answer is yes too. I think it's where we're heading. If I could do another column in that one slide, the future could be that. I don't know if it's our last question, Jess, but I'd like to offer up a response to a question we have about, I believe we need Indigenous certified forests. And has anyone had success in implementing Principle 3? And in fact, there are a number of Indigenous owned forestry companies who had management responsibilities, who held tenures, and they were under the governance of their own community, so 100% Indigenous owned, that were some of the earliest adopters of FSC certification. So I think, and I always give credit to a lot of the learning that went on in FSC from 1996, I believe, when the first standard came out, to today. A lot of the learning offered and shared through certification in FSC came from those early experiences of communities. There's a lot of some of these forests aren't, and there was 2 on the West Coast, 1 I believe in the East. For sure, these forests aren't FSC certified anymore. But we do have some other examples. We have the Haida, who have TON forest products up on Haida Gwaii. They are FSC certified. Mystic, of course, and there may be others coming online. So in terms of the implementing Principle 3, where it comes to the major question of how do you, if you are an Indigenous organization or you are an Indigenous company, how do you implement a principle that is meant to recognize and protect your rights? Well, it's not as easy as it sounds, because one of the important principles is you have to also look towards your neighbors. So it has done, for those First Nations that are FSC certified, it has also encouraged them to reach out to their neighbors and engage in a way that perhaps they didn't have an opportunity before, or maybe the platform wasn't there to address sort of common ground interests, maybe in forestry or forest development. And at the same time, though, just like any other company, it also, there's examples of, it's introduced challenges, because you have a company that, again, is kind of holding and implementing a provincial process. But still, whether you're First Nations owned or not, Principle 3 is still required, and you still have to be audited to it, and the standards are there.
Some people would ask the question, does FSC work? Does FSC work? And I would encourage any Indigenous community that has FSC in their traditional territory, it works as well as you engage it. And that's part of why we're trying to do this outreach and engagement, is to increase and create that awareness and knowledge and outreach. And Elena is going to continue to make 155 plus friends of First Nations that are affected by existing certificate holders, and continue to send emails. And if she's sending them to the wrong people, please let her know. And we'll continue to put out these webinars. But the question, does it work? Yes, certificate holders have had their certificates pulled for having exceeded the non-conformances and not upholding their responsibilities in annual audits to provide the information. Some of it revolving around species at risk, and some of it revolving around upholding Indigenous people's rights. It works.
Oh, thanks very much, David. That was a bonus question and answer. Thank you. And I'm sure it's a very motivating question. So with that, we have come to the end of our time together. We really want to thank everyone for your time and allowing us to take up more time than we have asked for going a bit over. We will be posting the questions and summarizing them together into a short summary document, what we heard, to accompany this webinar that goes on WDGP's website, and that has come up in the chat. So we thank you so much for your time. Thanks to all the panelists for your great presentations and your time taken for the question and answer at the end. And thank you, all of you, for participating today. Thanks so much, and we look forward to connecting again in the future. Miigwech.
Miigwech, everyone.